everybody, my name's Melissa and welcome back to my channel, Hopeful Happenings. Today we're talking writing tips for choosing the best viewpoint for your book. One of the first things that you figure out when you start writing a story is your viewpoint. Whether deliberately or not, you make a decision on who you will have telling the story. In this video, we'll talk about how to choose the best viewpoint or viewpoints for your story and why choosing the wrong viewpoint could be disastrous. Let's start by talking about a story that has no viewpoint character. If the story has no viewpoint character, then that means we're seeing the story through the author's eyes. This is called an omniscient point of view. Through omniscient narration, the author can tell us what multiple people are thinking, feeling, and seeing. Modern novels are not normally written in omniscient point of view any longer. And if you're thinking about doing it, that's fine, but just beware of the 3 Ds. Distance, disconnect, and disinterest. When we're writing from an omniscient point of view, we're not so much connected to the individual characters because we're in everybody's head. And this means that we're not invested as much into each individual character. This distance that we have from the character causes a disconnect, and when we're disconnected, often we just are disinterested. Obviously, there are authors out there who can do a great job at doing this, but nowadays it seems that most authors and readers prefer to be more up close and personal with the characters. We prefer to be like right in their head. We also often prefer to see the world through only one person's point of view instead of like a god overlooking the story. Young adult is particularly fond of getting right inside the character's head. This is called first person, and examples would be like Hunger Games or Divergent. That's where we go right inside the head of the character and we know exactly what they're thinking, feeling, because they are the ones telling the story. Children's novels are more often in third person limited, where we're not in the character's head per se, but we do get to see the story through the character's experience. For example, Harry Potter, or like a younger kid's book, Franklin. This is not a set rule, of course. There are young adult novels out there that are in third person and they do really well, like The Maze Runner, and there are middle grade novels that are in first person that do awesome, such as Percy Jackson. The most important thing that you need to do when writing your novel, no matter what point of view you choose, is to have the reader connect with your character. Help the reader identify with your main character. This is a must if you want the reader to actually care about what happens to them. Now, it's easiest to identify with a character if there's only one viewpoint. Single viewpoints are probably the most common. Partially because if you're writing a shorter story, you just don't have time to have multiple viewpoints. But another reason is because it allows the reader to fully invest themselves into this one character. We can feel all these big emotions of the character, like sadness, anger, happiness, when there's only one person to focus on. Let's just imagine a scenario where there's a kid who gets his lunch stolen by a bully at school. Okay, if I'm the kid and I'm telling you this from my personal perspective, like a first person story, you are gonna know all of my emotions, my anger, my embarrassment, and it's gonna be like raw. But now let's say I add another viewpoint of the bully, and we learn from the bully's perspective that he was having a hard day and that his parents didn't like him, and that's why he acted out and threw this person's lunch on the ground and then took his fruit roll up. Now that I know what the bully's viewpoint is, my emotions are clashing because I know that the kid who was embarrassed deserved those emotions, but the bully also has his own problems. I kind of feel bad for him now. And let's say I add another viewpoint of the lunch lady who was watching the whole thing, and maybe she watched it and didn't even intervene. Now I'm in that person's head and I'm thinking about what she's thinking. Do you see how the more viewpoints you add, the harder it is to pick the emotion the reader is supposed to feel, and it kind of distances them from the story. Okay, so some things about single viewpoint. If you're gonna do a single viewpoint in your story, then you need to make sure that it's happening to your protagonist. The reason for this is because the story happens to the protagonist. We want to follow along the story through the person that it's actually happening to and the one who's causing the changes. Now, your job as a writer is to pick the right protagonist. Sometimes it's not who you originally thought it would be. Let's look back at the lunch story. You could write a story about a kid who got his lunch stolen, but you could also write the story through the perspective of the bully, like he's the protagonist. Or maybe the story is actually about the lunch lady. Choosing the right protagonist makes all the difference in what this story will become. Sometimes if you feel like your story is missing something, or it's falling flat, it might not be the plot. It could actually be the character that you've chosen to tell us about the plot. Your viewpoint character, your protagonist. If you're not sure which character needs to be the protagonist, here's my trick. Choose the character who has the most need of change in their life. The one who needs to learn the biggest lesson. That's who should tell the story. There is one exception for not having your protagonist be the viewpoint character, and that is called a displaced viewpoint character. For example, in Sherlock Holmes, Sherlock is probably what you would say is the main character, but we're not reading the story through Sherlock's perspective, we're reading it through Watson's. The Great Gatsby does the same kind of thing. Only use a displaced viewpoint character if you are deliberately trying to have the reader not connect too much with the protagonist. Probably to keep the protagonist more mysterious or alienated. So going back to Sherlock, Sherlock is like this genius person, right? He's not like everybody else. So it's going to be kind of hard to connect with him anyways. That's why we're seeing the story through Watson, who is an average person. We can identify with Watson more than Sherlock. So it's easier to read the story from his perspective, and then he can comment on how brilliant Sherlock is, and we can see that because we are also the average Joes here. Okay, multiple viewpoints. Let's say you've decided that your story needs to have multiple viewpoints. Maybe this is because you have two different settings. Your plot and your subplot are not happening in the same place, and you want to build suspense by not having the main character know everything that's going on. Or perhaps you need to show a scene, but it's ultimately impossible for your protagonist to be there, and summarizing it to the protagonist just doesn't do it justice. So if your novel will switch viewpoints, you need to do it soon as possible. Let the reader know the rules of the story so that when you switch viewpoints, it's not jarring. Now be careful. If you don't handle the switch properly, it's going to throw off your reader. And if you're submitting to an agent or an editor, throwing out a badly switched viewpoint is going to peg you as an amateur, and they're going to reject. The 3 ways that you can make a clean switch to a new viewpoint is a new scene, a new chapter, or a new part. Changing viewpoints in the same scene is often called head hopping, and that's a big no-no. I'll say that again. Do not change viewpoint characters in the same scene. Sometimes authors do scene-by-scene switches at the very beginning of their book so that it's right in your face right away. Okay, I know I'm going to be reading this story through Joe's perspective and Nancy's perspective because the author showed me that right away. But then once you've established what the norm is, you can do whatever. You can do it chapter by chapter or maybe skip a few chapters because you've established what the rules are at the very beginning. If you have multiple different viewpoints, meaning more than 2 viewpoints, like in Salt to the Sea, then you'll need to weave details about the characters into the story before we actually get into their head. In Salt to the Sea, there's a character who sees a girl in the forest and she's in trouble. And we see that through his perspective. And then after we are introduced to her, then we get to go into her head. And it's less jarring because we were just seeing her from his perspective and now we're in her head, and it's not so much of like a cut off of 2 different stories. They're kind of linked together. It just makes everything smoother. I mean, if you want to write a book with multiple viewpoints, then you really need to read Salt to the Sea. That book does an amazing job of handling different viewpoints. Well, there you have it, guys. Those are my writing tips for choosing the best viewpoint for your story, whether it's single viewpoint or multiple viewpoints. I post once a week on YouTube and I post daily on Instagram, so please check me out. And thank you so much for watching. If you're new here, please subscribe and like this video if you found it helpful. Until next week, happy writing. Bye!